Um, I was, I spent about 20 years now studying acquisition of semantics. And it took me about 10 years to convince anybody that children had the inclusive or reading of disjunction. But I think we've progressed a lot in the last 10 or 15 years. And I think if you go to a conference like XPRAG, which didn't even exist 10 years ago, you'll see a lot of talks that were not even possible 20 years ago when I was busy trying to convince psychologists that disjunction was inclusive disjunction. And of course, a lot of this is due to Gennaro and his influence. I think his influence on me is slightly different and probably even runs deeper than for many people. The things that I want to talk about are not necessarily scalar implicatures, but some things that Gennaro discovered along the way that I think are more important than some of the technical details, because they help us adjudicate between different theories of language and different theories of language acquisition. So although Gennaro doesn't play the bongos as far as I know, I think that what I'm most impressed about is the similarity between Gennaro's approach to language and what I've tried to embrace in my studies of language acquisition, and Richard Feynman's approach to physics, where he says that curiosity demands that we ask questions. We try to put things together and understand these multitude of aspects as perhaps resulting from the action of a relatively small number of elementary things and forces acting in infinite array of combinations. And gradually we try to reduce the number of different things and thereby understand them better. Other people have said this. You probably recognize this guy who said the method of science, which is typically concerned with data not for itself, but as evidence for deeper hidden organizing principles that cannot be detected in the phenomena. And of course, this idea of unification is quite broad. I think the Aboriginal poet Bill Neji perhaps said it as well as anyone. And in particular, he focused on language, where he said language is different, like skin. Skin can be different, but blood, same. So this idea of unification, of course, is not new to Gennaro or to semantics. It's really a basic tenet of linguistics. What we're seeking in linguistics is unifying principles. And one of my favorite syntactic examples, of course, is principle C, which I have studied for many, many years as well. So as Chomsky points out, what we want to do is to use principle C to explain as broad a range of apparently disparate phenomena as possible. So not only does principle C explain why he and Peter received disjoint reference in referring expressions, like he said Peter criticized the prime minister. But of course, principle C is invoked again in strong crossover WH questions. Who did he say Peter criticized? In quantifier raising constructions, and more recently by people like Jason Merchant and Roz Thornton and other colleagues, even in discourse sequences. So Speaker A says, I know who he said criticized the prime minister, and Speaker B says, me too, Peter. Well, then the pronoun in Speaker A's comment doesn't refer to Peter. And we need an analysis of this, and people have proposed an analysis of this. And the analysis that's been proposed also carries over to things like pseudoclefs, where, again, even though there's no apparent surface C command between the pronoun and the referring expression, it seems to be disjoint reference. And so we need an account, and the account would be more unificational if it could just invoke the same principles that we need independently. So here's where Gennaro comes into the picture, at least for me. So he tried to explain how we could use the notion of downward entailment to explain another set of phenomena which will occur in the same language. And eventually I want to say how this ties to language acquisition. So building on work by Ladjasaw and others, we knew that English NPIs were licensed in the scope of downward entailing expressions, although of course there's a considerable cross-linguistic variation on this that requires subclasses of NPIs, and maybe I'll return to this if I have time. And it's been known for a long time, sort of independently at least, that disjunction typically generates a conjunctive interpretation when it appears in the scope of downward entailing expressions. And Gennaro has pointed out to us that downward entailing expressions license or suspend or reverse scalar implicatures. So there's these disparate looking phenomena, the downward entailment phenomena itself, licensing inferences from general terms to more specific terms, from sets to their subsets, the licensing of negative polarity items in the scope of downward entailing expressions, the disjunction receiving this conjunctive interpretation when it appears in the scope of downward entailing expressions, and the cancellation of scalar implicatures. So I tried to take this to heart in formulating what I think are fairly powerful poverty of stimulus arguments. And so that's really what I've tried to do in my own research. Rather than looking at the acquisition of scalar implicatures, sure, I've looked at that too, and I'll return to that. But I've been trying to follow the lead that Gennaro showed us when he tried to unify these different phenomena, and that's the thing that impresses me the most about his work. So these phenomena involving downward entailing expressions in themselves constitute sometimes poverty of stimulus arguments, as Gennaro made clear in a paper that I'll cite in a minute. But the fact that downward entailment unifies these seemingly diverse objects is really important. It's really important for cross-linguistic generalizations, for theories of language acquisition, and for distinguishing between theories of language, as I said. So not only are these diverse objects witnessed within individual languages, like Principle C explaining a broad range of effects in English, but if you look across typologically distinct languages like Mandarin Chinese and English and Japanese and Russian and so on, you see the same sets of phenomena occurring over and over again. This is a very powerful argument that something is going on that is very deep, a deep-seated regularity, as Chomsky likes to call it. And then we began to study this experimentally, and it turns out that children come to know some of the most complex facts in tandem, as far as we know, without instruction as early as they can be tested and across languages again. And one thing I do want to emphasize, it's really important to study these things in different languages, because different languages afford us opportunities to study things in ways that take us well beyond Indo-European languages. And I'll return to that point as well. So the findings, in fact, invite the inference that experience-based approaches that have been very prominent in Europe right now are just inadequate to the task of explaining language acquisition, and that we need to invoke principles of universal grammar in order to explain the phenomena, the very basic phenomena within a language, but also why it is that children are learning these things at a very early age with absolutely no instruction. Okay, so the phenomena are familiar to you. I'm not going to go over it. I just want to remind you that this is a cross-linguistic phenomenon. It's something that we can investigate. It gives us an opportunity to see how children are mastering different structures. So in language after language, the restrictor, or the internal argument of the universal quantifier, is downward entailing, but its external argument, the predicate phrase or nuclear scope, is not. this alone would pose this asymmetry between where we can license inferences from general terms to specific terms would alone pose a learnability problem for many accounts of language acquisition. But this is certainly not a phenomena that's limited to English. So if you translate these sentences into Mandarin Chinese, where the universal quantifier is mega, and well, Dou is providing some universal quantification as well, then we get straightforwardly the same phenomena. The internal argument licenses inferences from car to Prius car, and the same will be, and the predicate phrase does not license such inferences. And when we translate this again into Japanese, you get exactly the same phenomena. So even though the word order is completely reversed, you get the same inference from sets to subsets in the internal argument of the universal quantifier, but not in the predicate phrase or in its external argument. And then when we look at disjunction, I've been using disjunction as a sort of test for children's awareness of the properties of universal quantification. So because for adult speakers of English, the disjunction word or licenses the conjunctive interpretation or conjunctive entailment when it appears in the subject phrase or the internal argument of the universal quantifier. If children know this, and they do as early as they can be tested, if they know this, then it shows that they know that universal quantifier is downward entailing, despite its it doesn't appear to be negative in any strict sense. And they also know that when or appears in the nuclear scope or the external argument of the universal quantifier, that it doesn't license the conjunctive interpretation. So or can be interpreted as disjunctive, and they'll accept disjunctive truth conditions in that case. And this is true of Mandarin Chinese and in Japanese as well. So we've tested Mandarin-speaking children's interpretation of huojia, which is the disjunction word that most closely corresponds to or. And in the internal argument of mega, or with this Dou operator again, they know that every student who speaks French or Spanish passed the exam entails that every student who speaks French passed the exam and every student who speaks Spanish passed the exam. And this is true in Japanese as well. So some of this early work on ka, another disjunctive word that corresponds to huojia or has the same conjunctive entailment. And the conjunctive entailment does not extend to the predicate phrase or the external argument of these universal quantifiers across language. So children know these properties of downward entailment as early as they can be tested. We can show that they know these properties by looking at how they interpret disjunctive words in various languages. And all of these studies were sort of motivated by this idea that we ought to look at this unified set of properties. What about polarity-sensitive items? Well, we've looked at this quite a lot, and I want to focus a little bit on this today. So the word that comes closest to any in Mandarin Chinese is renha. And one interesting thing is that for Vanita's theory and for other theories is that renha is not licensed in the scope of the internal argument of the universal quantifier. It's pretty odd, and Mandarin-speaking adults don't like if you say everyone ate anything or everyone who ate anything was happy. Of course, it's even worse when it appears in the external argument of the universal quantifier. There, it's just completely bizarre to say everyone who was happy ate anything. But what you can do in Mandarin Chinese is you can use WH operators as it were, negative polarity items, or polarity-sensitive items. So if you put shenma in the internal argument of the universal quantifier, then you get something that corresponds to everyone who ate anything was happy. The interesting thing about Mandarin Chinese is if you put shenma in the external argument of the universal quantifier, so it's outside the scope of the downward entailing operator, it cannot be used as a polarity-sensitive item. So shenma becomes a WH word. So if you say everyone who was happy ate what thing, then it means what thing did everyone who was happy eat. So we want to take advantage of this fact that in Mandarin Chinese, shenma is completely, has a completely different interpretation when it's in the external argument of the universal quantifier versus when it's in the internal argument of the universal quantifier. Again, this can tell us about when children know about downward entailment, but it can also tell us about other things, which I'll return to. Now, all of this didn't escape Gennaro, and in his 2001 paper, he raises this issue and tries to talk about the relationship between negative polarity licensing and the interpretation of disjunction. And he says, as far as the interpretation of disjunction goes, and this constitutes a very strong, powerful poverty of the stimulus argument, because it's not just about distributional analysis. The word or freely occurs in various linguistic environments, but it receives a different interpretation in those environments. So he says you might be able to, the child, we don't know how, but could possibly figure out using a distributional analysis where words like any are licensed and where they're not. But distributional analysis seems to be beside the point when it comes to the interpretation of disjunction. But I think what is more important for my purposes, at least in studies of child language, is that these two things are related in Gennaro's attempts at trying to relate these two things. Now, there's a lot at stake here because, as Jerry Fodor suggested, the whole of cognitive science sort of depends on the viability of arguments from the poverty of the stimulus. I think Chomsky makes this point a lot about whether people believe in that there's language at all. And of course, other people have suggested that it better not depend on the availability of good poverty of stimulus arguments because, as Pullum and Schultz have suggested, that there aren't very good poverty of stimulus arguments. Why not? Well, because, how could I be so wrong? Because empiricist approaches to learning possess resources that have hitherto not been properly appreciated. And there's really good evidence that children are perfectly well able to acquire these abstract concepts just through statistical analyses. Well, I think not. And I think there's pretty good poverty of stimulus arguments that we've been amassing over the last 10 or 15 years. One of the nicest ones, I think, has to do with work by Takuya Goro and work by Peng Zhou and our colleagues. Whereas when you take a disjunction word, we've seen now that disjunction, when it appears in lots of downward entailing environments, it generates this conjunctive interpretation. And negation's no exception to this. So in English, if we say John didn't bring beer or wine to the party, that generates the conjunctive interpretation. John didn't bring beer to the party, John didn't bring wine to the party, so we can license the inference that he didn't bring beer to the party and he didn't bring wine to the party. However, when you look at across languages, you see that languages divide up immediately into some languages that look a lot like English, but a lot of other languages don't look like English at all. Mandarin is one of them, Russian is one, and Japanese is one. So if you translate this sentence into Mandarin Chinese, where the negation word is mayo, not have, and again, boja is the disjunction word. If you say John didn't bring, John mayo, dai pijo hoja hongzhou, then he didn't bring beer or wine is what we say, and it has the same word order as English. But it means it's either beer he didn't bring to the party or it's wine that he didn't bring to the party. Now, one of the big issues that, as I said, that I've been confronted with for 20 years is whether any disjunction word in any natural language could be exclusive disjunction. But of course, this is not the reading that is assigned to these sentences by Mandarin-speaking adults. So Mandarin-speaking adults interpret John didn't bring beer or wine to the party, meaning that he brought beer to the party but not wine, or brought wine to the party but not beer. But exclusive disjunction under negation is false in the circumstances in which he brought exactly one to the party. It's only true if he brought both to the party or if he didn't bring either one. So adult speakers of Mandarin accept negative disjunctions when exactly one of the disjuncts is true, which is not the interpretation that's assigned by exclusive or. So what's going on? Well, the interesting thing is what's going on with children. So based on learnability considerations, Takuya Goro, who did the original work on this in Japanese, suggested that Mandarin-speaking children and Japanese-speaking children, in fact, all children speaking any language, ought to initially start off interpreting disjunction inside the scope of negation. And this is just based on learnability considerations in the absence of negative evidence. So he predicted that children learning Mandarin Chinese would interpret the pig didn't eat the carrot or the pepper as meaning that the pig didn't eat either one, and that adults would interpret it to mean that it's the carrot that the pig didn't eat or the pepper that the pig didn't eat. That prediction has been verified now in several languages, including Mandarin Chinese and in Japanese, where if you give a reward to the pig if he eats one vegetable, you give a better reward to the pig if he eats both. But if he eats one vegetable, say a carrot, but not the green pepper, he gets this blue medal. Well, then if you say the pig didn't eat the carrot or the pepper to Mandarin-speaking children, they reject that sentence if he has the blue medal. And they'll tell you, well, he has the blue medal, so he must have eaten one, so you're wrong to say that he didn't eat either one. So they reject this target sentence 97% of the time. So they're interpreting disjunction in the scope of negation. Adult speakers accept it about the same amount of the time. Okay, so here's a good poverty of a stimulus argument. Children are not learning negated disjunctions on the basis of the evidence that's provided to them from adults. For children, John didn't bring beer or wine to the party in Mandarin or in Japanese or in Turkish or Russian. Means he didn't bring either beer or wine to the party, but for adults it means it's either beer he didn't bring or wine that he didn't bring. Okay, now I want to turn to conditionals, since Gennaro, when I first moved to Maryland, I invited Gennaro to come to a conference on Chinese, because I thought he had something to say about this. And he was speaking about these WH, or bear, conditionals. And there are three kinds of conditionals in Mandarin Chinese. There are Ruguo conditionals, roughly like if then. Ruguo means if. There are Do conditionals, which I want to look at. They look a little bit like David Lewis's adverbs of quantification. So even if the Do appears in the consequent of a conditional, then it can have scope over things that are in the antecedent to its left. So it looks as though it has this sort of scope over everything sort of interpretation. Actually, it doesn't, but it looks like that. And then there are these WH conditionals. So in the antecedent of conditionals, we do get both Renha NPIs and Chunma NPIs. Probably not really proper to call them NPIs, but anyway, these polarity words are licensed in these conditionals. So just like in English, if we say, if Ted orders anything for lunch, John will be surprised. But in Mandarin, we can say this using a Do conditional, where Do is a word like all, it can mean both or all, and it appears in the consequent clause, and it can take scope to things that precede it. In fact, it has to be a plural thing that precedes it. And it can license any, so we can say in Mandarin Chinese, Ted order run ha thing, and John all will feel very surprised. It probably sounds a bit strange to you, but it's a perfectly normal sentence. But we can also use Shunma in this case, so we can say Ted ordered what thing, John all will feel very surprised. Okay, now Do is a particular, it's a very unusual word, and I haven't seen anything like it. It quantifies over any kind of thing, but it gives universal force to WH operators. So it works pretty much like a free choice item or whatever sort of expression. Okay, so I'll turn to that. So WH words in Mandarin Chinese are really, have two functions. They either can have an interrogative function. They can mean Shay means who and Shenma means what, or they can have a non-interrogative function. And when they have, so Gennaro's has a proposal about this, where when they are WH indefinites, they can be licensed by one of two operators. So they receive, they are WH words if they're licensed by one of these WH operators. But when they're licensed, when they have non-interrogative force, they're licensed by some only operator, some O operator, and that's Do. Okay, so here's a typical Do conditional. You ask who, enter, I all see, meaning whoever you ask to come in, I'm going to see them, or whatever you want to eat, I'll buy it for you. So do will license the shenmo word in these situations. Okay, so we'll skip all this stuff. The interesting sort of thing, for me at least, is that this is accomplished within Gennaro's proposal by recursive exhaustification. And that includes both considerations factoring in the subdomain alternatives, but also the scalar alternatives. Now, we can use a language like Mandarin Chinese to see whether children have this free choice inference with do by testing sentences with do and without do. So take a sentence like type 1, where we have do. So this sentence means, whoever Mr. Crocodile went to bite, Mr. Owl asks Superman for help. Okay, but if we take out the do, then it's not licensed. Then it's licensed by a covert WH operator, and it becomes a question. So as soon as do is removed, then this free choice inference is eliminated, and it asks the question, who did Mr. Owl ask Spider-Man to help when Mr. Crocodile went to bite that person? Okay, so we tested children at 4 years and 3 months old, as young as 3, 5, and Mandarin-speaking adults. This was a question statement task, which was devised especially for doing these studies in Mandarin Chinese, where the question, where the issue is whether the WH word shenma or shay or whatever it is a question, is interrogative or non-interrogative. So we needed a new task to see that, and we developed this task. Okay, so here's a typical story. Here's Mr. Owl. He's the leader of the village. You'll recognize this from your traditional Chinese heritage. He's the elder of the village, and here are the people in the village: a pig and a rabbit and some other critter, which I can't recognize. Now the problem with this village is that a crocodile, comes at night and tries to eat the villagers. And Mr. Owl, of course, he's the elder, and he has to try to prevent the crocodile from eating the villagers. So, well, fortunately, he has some superhero friends, Batman and Superman, so he can call on them to help stave off the evilness of the crocodile. So here comes the crocodile, and he's going to eat Mr. Pig. So Mr. Owl then calls on his superhero friend to make the crocodile go away and not eat Mr. Pig that night. Okay, so he scares away the crocodile, and he gets rewarded with a reward. And the next night, the crocodile comes back, and he's going to eat the pig again. So Mr. Owl calls on his superhero friend again. This is Spider-Man, and Spider-Man shoves the crocodile away. The next night, the crocodile has learned better than to eat pigs. He's going to eat the rabbit. So he comes to attack the rabbit, and this time Mr. Owl calls on Mr. Batman, and Batman, of course, makes the crocodile go away, and the crocodile leaves the village and never returns. So it's a famous story in Chinese. So then we give the two sentences to the child with do and without do, and with do, the question is saying, well, whoever Mr. Crocodile went to bite, Mr. Owl would ask Superman for help, and that's just false, right? Because this is a free choice inference. So it would be, anybody that Mr. Crocodile went to bite, the owl would ask Superman for help, and that's false because he asked, or Spider-Man for help. He asked Batman for help for the rabbit. Or you could, without do, then the question, it just becomes a question: who did Mr. Owl ask Spider-Man to help when Mr. Crocodile went to bite that person, that animal? And the answer to that would be the pig. Okay, so how successful are children at this task? Well, they're about as successful as adults are at generating these free choice inferences. So when it's a statement, they answer that it's a statement that the puppet made, and then they take it to be false. So they reject it at 86% of the time, and adults reject it at 90% of the time. When it's a question, they answer the question correctly 86% of the time, and adults answer it 100% of the time. So children know, this is a way to test whether children know the properties of do. That was the purpose of the experiment. They know that the do has universal force, that it takes a WH indefinite and turns it into a free choice or conjunctive interpretation. So apparently children at this age, at 3.5 years old, can compute recursive exhaustification. Okay, so these experimental results and the ones that I briefly went on before demonstrate very early mastery of knowledge of these sophisticated properties of formal semantics, and also try to show you that you can use special properties of individual languages which would enable us to get at these sorts of properties. And Jacopo and colleagues are also looking at free choice inferences with disjunction and so on, finding the same thing, that children at the ages at which they're failing to compute scalar implicatures are just absolutely marvelous at computing free choice inferences. So that's a little bit of a challenge. Some of this is a challenge to unified theories of these things, but I think that's really what makes life interesting, and I think life would have been a lot less interesting if Gennaro hadn't attempted to make these unifying principles and to bring things together that at first sight look different and thereby reduce the number of things and try and attempt to understand them better. So thanks to you, Gennaro, and thanks from all of us.
I hope this doesn't come off as extremely pedantic, but I have some issues with some of the arguments for poverty of stimulus that you gave, and I wonder if you could clarify. So in particular, the issue about disjunction. So if I understood you correctly, your argument from Chinese was that so there's no way that children could have learned these sort of De Morgan interactions between negation and conjunction because it doesn't occur in the parent's language.
Yeah.
But the problem I have with that is that if Chinese is anything like French, German, and Russian, and so forth, what's happened is that disjunction is a positive polarity item, which means that it cannot scope under a tautosentential negation. But that doesn't mean that you can't have things of the sort, did you see your mommy or daddy, and somebody says no. So there will be, so presumably this occurs in the language, so that there will be ways that the child will learn this meaning, and that it just simply the child just didn't understand that or is a positive polarity item, and it will learn that later. So that there's no poverty of the stimulus argument, for example. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I'm assuming that it is a positive polarity item for adults, and that children will be exposed to enough instances where it's one or the other that John didn't bring to the party, and so on. And as far as your case of disjunction under absolute negative answer, that's a universal as far as I know. It has to be interpreted as a conjunctive interpretation of disjunctions. There is evidence, but that wasn't the guy that I was attacking in this case. It was an experience-based approach, which is saying that they're individual constructions, and for each of these constructions, the child will attempt to model the behavior of the adult. That clearly is not what's going on. As I said, these arguments from poverty of stimulus are arguments against some accounts. But of course, if you make generalizations and you think that if you think that there's a class of downward entailing expressions, all they need to do is hear disjunction in one of the classes, and then they'll extend it to other classes. Well, then there's no poverty of stimulus argument at all. But then you're sort of buying into at least a little bit of UG, which is saying that the child's incorporating generalizations into their grammar. I was really arguing against a more radical approach where the child is supposed to be mimicking the adult construction by construction, and that doesn't seem to be the case for this particular example.
Thanks.
That's actually the analysis that Goro gave, although he gave a syntactic account of the polarity sensitivity. But you can do perfectly well with an account of taking disjunction to be a positive polarity item.
So So you briefly mentioned the other free choice item, Renha.
Right. No, that's a negative polarity item.
Yeah, sorry. So how does that correlate with the kind of data you have? I just wondered if you wanted to elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, the thing that I thought you would find interesting is that it's not licensed under the universal quantifier, whereas the WH expressions are licensed. So it seems like the negative polarity item itself, the any item, is not the same, it doesn't receive the same interpretation as the WH indefinites, like shenma or she. But in the do conditional, it's interpreted, there it's interpreted in the same way.
And its acquisition is at the same time? You mentioned something about...
Well, they're all, these studies are all separate studies. So there's no study that looked at she and shenma at the same time as renha. We have looked at these things independently, and we don't see, and these words are complex. So there are, interpretations of these words that I've just swept under the rug that you may be familiar with. But what we see, over and over again is that children have a consistent interpretation of these words, and at least that interpretation is of these free choice inferences or of the negative polarity item any. But they do come apart for adults at least, and so I thought, yeah, you would find that interesting.
One question, I guess, that comes up is just how do you differentiate disjunction from conjunction and acquisition? Yeah. And I mean, one possibility that arises from your work is that you might need something like negation in order to pull this off. I mean, I don't know if you've thought about this.
Yeah, I thought a lot about it, as you can imagine. So for conjunction, in Mandarin Chinese, conjunction is also a polarity-sensitive item. So the Mandarin word for conjunction is he, and it takes scope over negation in Mandarin. And the prediction that we made was that it would actually, English-speaking children would interpret conjunction as taking scope over negation. So again, for reasons of language learnability, and that proved to be true as well. So English-speaking children will interpret John didn't bring wine and beer to the party, as meaning he didn't bring either one. Now the way to disentangle these things, well, there's two ways, and they've been very familiar for a long time. One way was pointed out, I think originally by Lee Baker in the 70s, which is that if negation is in a clause higher than the clause that contains disjunction or conjunction, then there's no polarity sensitivity. And so you get the logical interpretations of these words. So you'll never convince me that John brought beer and wine to the party. Means you'll never convince me that he brought both. So you get the not both reading. And this can't be tested on children. But we did test children with the other diagnostic test for the logical interpretation, which is in the predicate phrase of focus operators. So GO is the focus operator corresponding to only in Mandarin Chinese. And if you say only John brought beer and wine to the party, then that means everybody else didn't bring both of them to the party. And this, again, is a universal principle as far as I know. And in those sentences, they distinguish, they have the not both reading, both children and adults in every language that we've looked at. So there's no confusion of or and, because or receives its Boolean interpretation in the predicate phrase of a geo phrase, of a focus operator like geo. So they're completely distinguished by both children and adults. But it is a puzzle with some of these, these more simple phenomena, whether they're just interpreting them the same. So what we did is we, just had controls and tried to show that they would assign different truth conditions for or and in these studies.
What you're saying is that you have diagnostics for telling us when they differentiate.
And children know those.
But I guess the question is whether that diagnostic is the mechanism by which they differentiate them in acquisition, or if it's not, so what is how are the lexical items themselves differentiated?
Well, the lexical items, on this particular proposal come from, universal grammar, so that's just innate.
How do you know which one is and which one is for?
How does the child know?
Yeah.
You mean?
I mean, I guess one suggestion that might come out of your work is that this is related precisely to understanding something about negation and the way these two operators interact with negation.
I take it that, again, Gennaro has told us how these things can be related. I take the disjunctions are just existential items, so they just can function freely as either negative polarity items or as WH existentials or as words like some. So you know, in a language like Japanese, if you want to say somebody left, you say who or left. And in other languages, you have the same sort of property. So the disjunction, I mean, it's not just learning the disjunction. You learn that a whole range of existential expressions will occur in certain environments and not in other environments. So the unification comes to the child's aid at being able to separate these things out.
I just want to add a piece of data about disjunction so as to make the question more complicated. So, as in a simple sentence, as you mentioned, John didn't go to Beijing, or Shanghai has conjunction meaning. He didn't. Either he didn't go to Beijing or he didn't go to Shanghai.
Right.
However, in the embedded sentence, for instance, if sentence like John doesn't want to go to Beijing. John doesn't want to go to Beijing or Shanghai, has the exact same meaning as John doesn't go to Shanghai and Beijing.
That's right. Yeah, that was Lee Baker's original insight. That polarity sensitivity is very shallow phenomena. It's local, and the negation has to be overt. So there are these two properties that people like Anazabochi and Baker showed. So if you separate them, even by yo, even as small a word as that, then you get the conjunctive interpretation, which is exactly what you did. So if you say, you know, I used the example of you'll never convince me that John brought beer or wine to the party. Well, if you translate that into Mandarin Chinese, then it means you'll never convince me that John brought beer, and you'll never convince me that John brought wine to the party. So it's just a matter of separating disjunction from the negation operator mayo, and then you get it becomes well formed, and you can't. But I wasn't saying that kids. That test has never been done on children actually, because it's a pretty complicated experiment. But the other test with the focus operators has been done, and it shows that kids know that in the entailment, when there's no overt negation, then in the entailment, you know, what's called the assertion that as for everybody else, they didn't bring beer or wine to the party. That's exactly the same in Japanese or in Mandarin as in English, and they get the conjunctive entailment of disjunction in the entailment. So it's really a matter of just performing these diagnostic tests, and then you see that all languages have inclusive disjunction. The thing I've been trying to convince psychologists of for many, many years, and still to this day, I'm not successful.
This is not really so much a question to the main things that you have addressed in this particular talk, but to the last point that you made at the end, as it relates to the findings that you have here, namely the fact that you and Jacob and I gather other people in France are discovering over and over that children seem to have no problem with free choice implicatures.
Right.
Now, you know, if, of course, we can be wrong that those things are implicatures, or we can have the wrong theory of implicatures. The question is, however, that the fact that they are lies on very weakly theory-bound assumptions, right? So, you know, you may have A or B, must be, or typically is interpreted as you may have A and you may have B, but this doesn't happen in doublementating context,
Right.
and it doesn't happen in the antecedent of conditionals. And maybe it's even cancelable, as in you may have A or B, and I don't remember which. So the fact that they are, in some sense, implicature-like, is hard to, you know, to think of anything else given these facts. And this makes the fact that they are learned so easily with respect to scalar implicature pretty dramatic. And
Yeah.
so you can't give a 2 minutes answer, but where should we be looking in this case? What?
I think I can't give a simple answer, but I think we've been trying to figure this out a little bit. Jacopo probably has more to say about this than I do, but
This is a low, because this is not what the talk was about.
yeah, well, if I can avoid the low blow, I think I will. Yeah. I think there seem to be a lot of results that are difficult to explain, and this is just one of them that I wanted to bring to your attention.
I think also English, at least in German, works very fine. It's very natural also to say you may do A or you may do B, which is hopeless, I think, or almost hopeless for a purely pragmatic account. Let's call it like that. Huh? Just to add to the confusion.
Yeah. We're going to stop.
I'm sorry, it's not over yet. I know you guys want to go drinking, but you have to wait like a few more minutes, okay? Because we have the last secret presentation.